Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Niamh Lahertig, and I'm a member of the Marine Protected Areas team here in the Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment. So on behalf of the department, I just want to say thanks a million for joining us here this afternoon and to welcome you. So the purpose of today is to update you on what we have been doing as part of the sensitivity analysis of our Atlantic waters. This project is being carried out by an independent advisory group, which is co-chaired by Professor Louise Alcock of University of Galway and Professor Tasman Crowe of University College Dublin, who will be presenting to you shortly. It builds on similar work that has been done in the Irish and Celtic Seas, and the group's findings will be presented to the Minister very early next year. Some of you will be aware that we held an introductory webinar for this project in March, and we followed it up with 2 in-person stakeholder events at the end of March in Limerick and the beginning of April in Sligo. It was great to see people attending there. The purpose of those events was to present you with the draft list of features in the maritime area, which the advisory group are considering as requiring protection. We also followed this up with the opportunity for all our stakeholders to give us their views on this list in writing. So today we want to update you on the outcomes of all this engagement and outline where we will be going from here. So before I hand over to Professor Tasman Crowe, just to note, you probably see it up in the corner of your screen, this session is being recorded and will be available shortly on the department's website. We will let you know when it becomes available. And I probably should add that we're having a Q&A at the end. This part of the session won't be recorded. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Professor Crowe.
Great, thanks very much, Niamh, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. So just to say at the outset, we're here really to give a presentation on behalf of a larger team, and we'll highlight that the whole team membership at the end. And also to add that these slides will be made available to you, and the outputs of the previous 2 projects are already available online via the link on this first slide. So if you want to get a sense of what we're doing with more detail, you can go and have a look there. As Niamh said, we'll be taking questions through the Q&A function after the talk, and we'd also be happy to take further questions by email subsequently. So I'm just here to quickly set the scene, and just there we go. So really, the kind of the starting point for all of this work is the kind of rich diversity of marine habitats and species that we have in Ireland, which are wonderful in their own right, but also underpin important and productive ecosystems. And so, as you know, our marine environment is a critical contributor to our culture, economy, and society. It supports a wide range of important activities which need to be supported and also sustainably managed so that they continue to be productive for this and future generations. Marine protected areas are one part of our approach to that process, and we currently have about 10% coverage of marine protection, essentially all in the form of Natura 2000 sites under the EU Birds and Habitats Directives. That process of designation under Natura is still ongoing, but it's nearing completion. And the sites under our national legislation, which is in development, will be combined with them so that we can meet our commitment to get to a 30% total coverage. In the meantime, we've been actively working on a series of interim ecological sensitivity analyses. We've completed them for the Irish Sea and the Celtic Sea, and we're working on one now for the Atlantic region. And this process is the focus of today's webinar. The idea is that this work will help ensure that areas potentially suitable for designation as MPAs will be set aside during the ORE planning process, and that the MPA areas would also take into account other sectoral interests, particularly fishing and shipping. And ultimately, this work will inform the future process for selecting and designating national MPAs. So do keep in mind that this is just one step along that path and not by any means the final outcome. We've also, all of these analyses have intersected with planning for offshore renewable energy, but the current one is also collaboratively integrated considerations linked to Natura sites and also nature restoration. So we're looking to develop a more integrated view as we progress further down this path. So we developed a structured process for these analyses with these steps that you can see on the screen. And each of the steps has a fully documented set of procedures and criteria for decision making. And the findings are based on the best available evidence and stakeholder input. So the whole thing is intended to be transparent and open for discussion and so on. And as Niamh mentioned, we've had a series of stakeholder engagements already. And the two most recent were workshops and a follow-up survey focused on the selection of features, which is just this first step in the process. So those features will go forward for analysis and modeling. And this is important because it will influence both where potential MPAs would be situated, but also the management measures that will be co-developed with stakeholders to conserve them. And most of the MPAs, I remember, are managed in such a way as to only protect the features for which they're designated. So activities that do not impinge on them are able to continue in the MPAs. And in some cases, other activities that potentially impinge on them can be modified or restricted to enable them to continue in some form. So we're mainly here today to give you an update on the feedback we received at those workshops and the follow-up survey and how we're taking it on board. And I'll hand you over to Louise now, who'll give that update. And then Emma will tell you a little bit more about the other opportunities for stakeholder participation as part of the process. So I'll hand over to Louise at that.
Thanks very much, Taz. So just to talk in detail about the feature selection process, I want to run you through how we do it, because an understanding of that is important in terms of understanding the stakeholder process. So we have criteria for selecting features, and we have 9 possible criteria under which something can be selected. They can be selected because they're conservation listed, either under OSPAR or the IUCN Red List. Or if they're in such decline, we think that they would qualify for an IUCN threatened category, we could also add them to our feature list. We've included anything that's conservation listed in the EU Birds or Habitats Directive, and that was following direct feedback from stakeholders during the work we did in the Irish Sea and the Celtic Sea. We add features of recognised ecological importance, biogenic features, for example, where they produce, where a species grows in such a way that it produces very rich biodiverse habitat. Our 5th criterion is areas of high biodiversity, naturalness or representativeness or sensitivity. And an example here would be ocean fronts, where we know many creatures aggregate in ocean fronts because of the food resources they provide. MPAs are meant to be representative of all your habitats, so we've included features that are broadly representative of the features in Irish waters. So benthic broad-scale habitats, such as those used in the MSFD, are an example of this. We can include areas that provide important ecosystem services, features that require restoration under the new nature restoration regulation. And we've also considered areas that might be a refuge from pressures. For example, there are known areas that are refuges from climate change. So those were the criteria under which we originally started selecting features. Those criteria are based on best practice internationally, and they are drawn also from a report that the Marine Protected Area Advisory Group published in October 2020. So everything is based on good best scientific practice. As well as meeting one of our 9 criteria, a feature also has to meet the 3 constraints below. Obviously, the Irish Atlantic needs to be part of the features range or extent, otherwise it's not worth considering it for an analysis of the Irish Atlantic area. If the feature was added because it was on a threatened species list, well, we also want to know that there's no significant local data-driven evidence to suggest that the threat category is no longer warranted, because some things went on the on red lists like maybe 20 years ago, and conservation measures have been put in place and they've recovered, and we don't want to be trying to protect something that no longer needs protection. And the other criterion is that feature must be amenable to spatial protection. So some species, for example, that are very vagrant, aren't really amenable to spatial protection. But even in this situation, sometimes they aggregate, for example, for breeding or other parts of their life cycle. And so it may be that they're amenable to spatial protection in one part of their life cycle. And then if we know where that life cycle takes place, then we can consider them appropriate for the feature list. So as Taz and Neve both indicated, we had in-person stakeholder workshops in March and April that took place in Limerick and Sligo. And at that time, we presented a not ready feature list to all stakeholders. This was deliberate because in our previous sensitivity analyses, stakeholders have indicated to us that they wish to be consulted earlier. At that workshop, we presented, actually just in advance of the workshop, we presented 8 pages of features that we, the MPA advisory group, believed met our criteria. We listed 2 pages of features that were still under active consideration. We thought there was a reason to consider them, that is, they met one of our 9 criteria, but we either hadn't yet determined their range, i.e. whether they were in the Atlantic or their current threat status or their amenability to spatial protection. So they were still on the maybe list. And then we had 2 pages of features that we had considered because they met at least one of our 9 criteria, but then we decided that they didn't qualify either because the Atlantic wasn't a significant part of their range, or we considered them no longer threatened, or we felt that none of their life stages were amenable to spatial protection, such that they'd need to be protected by other means. This is a sort of example of what we presented at the in-person stakeholder workshop. It was a lot of information. So this is just one of the pages. This was page 5 of the features meeting our criteria. And you can see there are all sorts of different things on there: habitats, ecosystem services, and in grey there we have species that are on the Natura list. Another example page here are the fish and invertebrates. You can see there's a huge number of cartilaginous fish. This was on a page of the features that was still under consideration that we hadn't made decisions on. Now you can see this is a huge amount of information to give to stakeholders, but it also has to be said that we had rooms full of extremely knowledgeable stakeholders who were very much up to the task that we gave them. The stakeholder workshops were pretty much a listening exercise. We went through groups of features on that spreadsheet, group by group. We asked stakeholders for specific feedback, roundtables, and we listened and we made a record of everything that was said. We had a rapporteur on every table. We then took all these opinions, suggestions, and advice from you back to the full MPA advisory group. And since that time, we've done a lot of digging further into the literature and data. We've consulted additional experts where appropriate. And our aim is to ensure that the final decisions on what goes on the features list is the right one for Ireland's Atlantic area. That work is still ongoing, but I give you a little sort of flavour of the kind of things that we have been doing in a moment. After the workshops, we then also sent out a Google form for stakeholders to submit further opinions if they wanted to. Some stakeholders did send responses through the Google form, and others felt that the Google form was too constraining and emailed us separate written submissions, all of which is fine. And all those submissions from the workshop, from the Google form, and those separate submissions are being given full consideration by us. Some of the submissions didn't necessarily relate to the actual feature list at the time. So I'm not responding to any of those today, but it doesn't matter. We'll deal with them in due course. And we will try, as we did in the Celtic Sea, to have an appendix in our final report that details everything that people said to us and what we did as a consequence. So just some examples of common topics that came up at stakeholder workshops or stakeholder submissions. One was elasmobranchs. If you were paying attention just now when I flashed the second page of the spreadsheet on the screen, you will have noticed that there were an awful lot of elasmobranchs on the list, still under consideration. So we had comments from stakeholders who wanted more elasmobranchs on the list, comments who thought that elasmobranchs were on the list that shouldn't be on the list, information on critical egg laying habitat, what should be included, what shouldn't, and it raised really a whole load of queries about elasmobranchs. So we have been to the sort of 2 key elasmobranch experts in the country, and we have gone through everything again on the list with them, dug into further information, and we're now just finalising that list of elasmobranchs now. But really, the comments from the stakeholders really informed us to go and dig deeper into this, and we now have. Another common topic that was brought up was that we didn't have enough invertebrates on our feature list, and stakeholders specifically advised us to go to the UK, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England priority species list and go through them species by species to see if any of these species would in fact meet our criteria. And the criteria behind the UK priority species lists are quite different from our criteria. So some species did meet and some species didn't. We've gone all through those lists. We've compiled a list of features that we think probably do meet these criteria, but some of these invertebrates it's quite specialist knowledge. So once again, now the consensus opinion of the MPA advisory group has gone out to 3 real specialists in Irish invertebrates for further consultation, and we expect those to come back to us within the next week or so. Another common topic was birds. One specific thing that we have done in response to stakeholder comments here was to consult the bird red and amber lists as advised, and we've been through those with Parks and Wildlife, with the birds experts at Parks and Wildlife, seeking further information to make sure that we've got the right birds on the list. And we had lots of comments on habitats, and habitats are really interesting because there are lots of ways of classifying habitats. So I've got 4 ways of classifying habitats on the screen here. And you can see they're all different, but they're also all overlapping. So we have the benthic broad-scale habitats that are used in the MSFD, and they have quite broad terminology: offshore circulittoral mud, infralittoral mixed sediment, circulittoral sand, etc. So they're really quite broad categories. Then we have OSPAR habitats. These are conservation listed, and that's how they would make it onto our list. And you can see, for example, their sea pens and burrowing megafauna. Well, that's something that occurs in offshore circulittoral mud. So we have sort of duplication there, where one is a subset of the other. If we look at the VME habitats, VME habitats are by definition ecologically important because they generate habitat for other organisms. And you can see there, well, for example, deep sea sponge aggregations on the ICES VME list is exactly the same as the deep sea sponge aggregations on the OSPAR habitats. So that's okay because we only need the term on the list once. But if we look, for example, at other VME habitats, they're finer scale than the categorization that OSPAR uses. So ICES would use hard-bottom Gorgonian and black coral gardens, hard-bottom coral gardens, which comprise colonial scleractinians on rocky outputs, whereas OSPAR just lumps them all together and calls them coral gardens. So we have to decide, how do we include those? And we have the same issue if we look at habitats in biotope levels. Now, obviously, we don't want to look at every single biotope because there would be no reason to add them to our list. But some biotopes are ecologically important because they form aggregations that enhance biodiversity of other species, for example. So again, we've got examples here where we've got deep sea sponge aggregations, but it's slightly more specific than VME. So what we needed was a big reconciliation process to make sure that we had everything that needed to be on the features list on it, but not to have duplicates. However, it's impossible not to have everything on the list and not to have overlapping habitats. So the stakeholders quite correctly told us we needed to really think about how we were going to deal with this in the analysis. There are ways of dealing with it in the analysis. Obviously, if you pile multiple habitats on top of each other, any grid cell in your sensitivity analysis looks more sensitive. And so you've got to model that into the process to make sure you're not double accounting for a habitat that in that way. And we can do that, and we have nice ideas of how to do that now. That should work well. So again, something that we were driven to think more. It was already on our radar, but we thought harder about it as a result of stakeholder comments. So that was great. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of flavour of what we have done here. And so I'm going to pass on to my colleagues in a minute, but I would just like to say thank you to all the stakeholders for the very, very detailed knowledge that everybody brought to the table, the very engaging way that everybody interacted with us, and to some stakeholders who are now, as experts, further consulting with us. Like, we really appreciate all your input, and really feel that the features list this time has been very much co-created. We haven't quite finalised it. We expect to finalise it in the June meeting of the MP Advisory Group, which is at the end of June. And so hopefully we will be able to share a complete feature list at some point in the future. With that, I will stop sharing and I will hand over to my colleague Emma.
Yeah, I'm just sharing my screen. Is that okay? Can people see my screen?
Yes, that's
I think
perfect.
so. That's great. Okay, thanks very much. My name is Emma Verling and I'm from University College Cork. So along with my colleague David White, who's here on the panel today as well, we're supporting the department in the stakeholder engagement element of all this work. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to briefly talk you through the timeline that we have in terms of engaging with stakeholders, how we're managing it, and what you can expect in the next 6 months of the project. So on the screen here, you can see a timeline running from left to right there, January to December of this year. And where we are at the moment is in May. So we're where the little red arrow is in the middle. So we're kind of roughly halfway through this process. And as Taz said very clearly, this is just one part of a very broad MPA process nationally. So this slide is only referring to the Atlantic sensitivity analysis work. So we started off in January, just going back slightly with our engagement plan, and sent an email out to everybody that we had on our list. We had the first of these webinars then in March, and some of you may have attended those. And they were followed by the workshops that Louise has just been speaking about, the first in Limerick and the second in Sligo. And they were really interactive, 2 very different workshops, but very, very helpful. And as Louise has shown, we got plenty of feedback from everybody. So there's a lot of work that's ongoing, as Louise has said, and we're here now where the red arrow is in the second of our webinars. So looking forward then into the time that's coming, I suppose the most important thing to say is this conservation prioritization modelling work will be ongoing during the summer months. And that's the next step in the technical scientific process that we're undertaking. But in terms of how we'll engage with you, well, in the summer, we may have another webinar if needed when we need to update you. But I think the most important thing I'd like to point out really is point 6 here. So sometime in the autumn, we're going to have some further in-person workshops that we'd love to see people attending. And those are going to be suitable area mapping workshops. So there'll be a different focus. As Taz and Louise said, the workshop that we had in March was very focused on the features list. This is going to be a different type of workshop, focusing on the suitable areas and really asking for input after the modelling process has taken place. So it's a different type of workshop, and we'll be letting you know of the dates of that in advance. But just to let you know, that's going to be happening, and we'd love to see more of you there if you can. We're moving forward then, and we'll have another of these webinars similar to this one, updating you after those in-person workshops are over. And then ultimately, I suppose, towards the end of the process, we'll be reporting on it and coming up to the last parts of it. So I think this is important to show you, just so that you can see what we're actually doing in this project, where you fit, what to expect, and at least then you know what's coming down the line. I have another slide here that I just wanted to talk a little bit about the input that we got from you at the workshops in March and April. And obviously Louise has shown some of the technical input that we got and some of the scientific work that's coming from that. Overall, I suppose we just wanted to say that the people who attended the workshops really were largely positive about the organisation and the running of those, and they did feel that the process we were trying to do was explain to them and how their input would be considered. So that was very important to us, because we want people to know why they're in the room and what we would like to talk to them about specifically. There was feedback and input provided on the features at the workshop and the Google form, and it's being addressed by the advisory group, as Louise has articulated. There were some queries regarding next steps and how the prioritization process will work. So those will be addressed going forward. So a lot of the queries, as Louise articulated, related to the broader process, and those can be addressed later on in the broader MPA and MPA Live process. But talking about specific actions taken, I mean, there were calls for more explanation, I suppose, on the broad concepts and context relating to MPAs. So in response to that, the department is preparing information and a timeline on the wider process. So I've shown a timeline of the Atlantic sensitivity analysis, but what we need to work towards is a timeline for the broader MPA process, and that work is underway. I think another thing important to say is the scope of influence. So what I mean by that is making it clear to people who take time out of their lives to come to these workshops, making it clear to them what they can influence and what can't be influenced by that process. That's very important. Some of the things can't change, and we need to make it clear what those are. And then other things, there's genuine space for influence, and that's where we want the influence to be. So we need to just work a bit harder to make it clear where the scope of influence is. And one of the nice suggestions, I think, was that people would like to see case studies of marine protected areas and examples of success elsewhere. Those examples do exist, and I think it's important to show those. So we're going to gather those and share them with you at the next time, because I think that's something that came strongly from both workshops. There was another very clear call as well to explicitly include socioeconomics and cultural elements in this process. And that's being considered and incorporated into the next steps. So that was another really clear thing that was coming out, and that's very much part of the broader MPA Live process as well. And the last point we have here, which is also a broader point but extremely important, is that people in the room were interested in how they could be involved in data collection and management of MPAs in the future, since they are going to be affected by this process. This is a very important point, and that's going to be also taken up in the MPA Live process following this. So that really brings to an end what I'm going to say. I'll come back at the end with the slide on how we are wanting to gather some feedback from you. But I'm going to stop sharing now and hand back to Taz. But there, as we say, there will be an opportunity to ask questions on any of this. I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, in fact, all I really want to say to kind of wrap up is to put this work in the context of that longer MPA process. And so, first of all, just to reiterate, of course, that MPA, marine protected areas, are just one of a range of approaches to marine conservation and management, and also by highlighting that this Atlantic area ecological sensitivity analysis is just one step along the way to expanding Ireland's network. So you can see that the Atlantic area ecological sensitivity analysis is here on the slide, but prior to that, there were two others, one for the Celtic Sea and one for the Irish Sea, and indeed prior to that, there was a report from the MPA advisory group. So going forward, when we complete this analysis at the end of the year, the next steps will be to integrate the results of the 3 ecological sensitivity analyses, and also to engage more fully with the wider networks of MPAs outside our borders to help to develop a coherent kind of transboundary approach. Then there'll be a long process of drafting proposals for the expanded network of MPAs, which will, in addition to the kind of findings from these sensitivity analyses, there'll be further scientific work, but also extensive stakeholder engagement, both to explore locations for MPAs, but also to explore management approaches. The other piece that was just mentioned by Emma as something that we were asked for is definitely planned. It's going to be led by Stephen Hines in the University of Galway as part of the MPA Life Island project, is a socioeconomic analysis to inform the final proposals and the decisions that will be made. And so then the designation itself would only happen after that. Okay, so there's a lot further to go down that road, and as has been mentioned, the kind of expected timeline, the amount of time it's going to take for each of these steps is still just being kind of finalized, but it should be released quite soon. And just to kind of a reminder that sort of the MPA Life Island project, which we're all involved with, is a key contributor to that process. And indeed, the team that's working on this Atlantic area sensitivity analysis is substantially made up of some of the members of that project, but also is complemented with other individuals bringing particular expertise needed to complete the work. And as Louise mentioned, we also consult extensively with relevant experts within and outside Ireland, and we've also been very appreciative of the stakeholder input that there's been so far, and we're looking forward to the next rounds of engagement as well to help us arrive at the best outcomes that we can collectively. So I'll leave it at that, and it's time for the Q&A.